winter had arrived on the island of Sodor, and all the engines knew what this meant, that Christmas was coming. And this year, Christmas was busier for them than it had ever been before. The Fat Controller was having to put on extra trains almost every day. He had even had to reassign Boko from his usual duties on Edward's branch line, the railway was that busy. There were some days when the engines felt like they had barely finished one run before they needed to start another. They were all becoming tired and exhausted. One morning, the Fat Controller was waiting at Brendam station when Edward backed down onto his train. The blue engine had just brought in a freight train from Knapford, and now he needed to take a passenger run back up to Tidmouth. "Edward," the Fat Controller began, "I know that things have been rather busy lately. Tell me, how are the other engines handling the workload?" He knew Edward usually had a good idea of that sort of thing. "To tell the truth, sir," Edward began, "things aren't going too well. We're barely getting any rest, and James in particular has been crankier than usual." "I see," replied the Fat Controller. "We really need another engine, sir," Edward continued. "Are you sure that Patrick isn't available?" he asked, thinking of the diesel from the other railway who had helped out on the island of Sodor a couple of times before. "I'm afraid the other railway cannot spare any engines either," the Fat Controller replied. "I don't suppose we could save one from scrap, could we, sir?" The Fat Controller shook his head. "Not in time for Christmas, I'm afraid." Suddenly an idea struck him, and his face lit up like a Christmas tree. Yes, he might be available. Yes, you've given me an idea, Edward. Thank you." Later that evening, Henry was waiting to take the flying kipper. Ben puffed up alongside. "Henry? The flying kipper's ready." "Thank you," Henry replied as he puffed off to take the train. He wondered why Ben had been surprised to see him there. As Henry puffed towards the siding where the kipper was waiting, he heard a strange, eerie whistle drift through the air. He looked over, worried. "That sounded like it came from the siding," he said. "I think we'd better stop, driver, just in case." Barely a moment after he had stopped, another engine puffed out of the siding with the flying kipper trailing behind him. Henry couldn't believe his eyes as his train disappeared into the night. All he had seen of the other locomotive had been a green shape with number 3 painted on the cab's sides. Ben quickly came alongside, looking just as surprised as Henry felt. "Henry," he said, "who was that?" "I don't know," Henry replied, "but I intend to find out." And with that he puffed off. The next morning, Henry was pulling a freight train. He was about to pass Knapford station when he spotted one of the station staff waving a red flag at him. "Driver," he began. "I saw it too, Henry," his driver replied. "We'll have to come alongside that train that's waiting in the station." As Henry slowed to a stop alongside the other train, he realised that the locomotive was a stranger. He caught sight of the LNER markings on the tender first, then the bright yellow number 3 painted on the cab. An angry look crossed Henry's face, but before he could say anything, the Fat Controller, who had been waiting on the platform, spoke up. "Henry, this is Alfred, a preserved locomotive who has come to help us out over the holidays." "I'm glad I could be of help," Alfred said. "It's not my first time here, you know." "I see," Henry said coldly. "And when would that have been?" "I replaced you for 5 months while you were being rebuilt at Crewe, after that accident with the flying kipper." "Yes," Henry replied. "That train that you stole last night." "I didn't steal it," Alfred replied. "The orders were that North West Railway number 3 was to take the train." "Yes," Henry replied, "and that's me." "Silence!" bellowed the Fat Controller. He looked sternly at both engines. "Christmas Eve is in 2 days," he said, "and I need both of you to be really useful engines. Alfred made an honest mistake. Let's just leave it at that." "Yes, sir," Henry agreed as he puffed off, still not happy. The next day, Alfred was on the point of a freight train. He pulled up outside Tidmouth so that his driver could go inside and talk to the dispatcher. James was waiting at the station with a passenger train. "What's wrong, Alfred?" he asked. "You look upset." "It's that clumsy Henry," Alfred replied. "If he hadn't had that accident with the flying kipper, I never would have needed to take his number." "We both know that accident wasn't Henry's fault," James replied. "And after all that," Alfred continued, ignoring James, "he has the audacity to accuse me of stealing his train." A moment later, a familiar whistle sounded out, and Henry puffed through the station carrying a special train of Christmas puddings. He had heard everything. The next day was Christmas Eve, and a massive snowstorm had hit the island. The sky was dark and snow filled the air. Visibility was very limited. It was around 5:30, and the last trains for the day were coming in. Alfred's fireman was filling his tender with water when his driver came up to him. "I've just been speaking to the station master," he said. "Gordon's been delayed, and somebody needs to pull the Yuletide Express." This wasn't really an express, but a special train that ran along the main line every Christmas Eve. It stopped at all stations from Knapford to Craven's Gate. As the last passenger train before Christmas, it was always packed with passengers travelling to be with their families and loved ones. "Does the Fat Controller want us to take it?" Alfred asked. "Yes, he does," Alfred's driver replied. He climbed up into Alfred's cab as Boko went past with the freight train. Once the line was clear, Alfred headed out for Knapford station. Gordon was just coming in as Alfred was backing down onto the train. "Be careful," Gordon called. "You could easily get stuck out there." "Thank you," Alfred replied. A short while later, Henry was resting on one of the sidings just outside Knapford. It was the first real rest he'd been able to get in the last 2 days. He opened one eye lazily as his driver came up to him. "Alfred's stuck in a snowdrift outside a tunnel," his driver said. "We've got to go rescue him." That was the last thing Henry wanted to hear. "Can't someone else do it?" he asked. "You're the only engine available," his driver replied. Henry was less than enthusiastic. "Come on, Henry," his driver said as he climbed aboard. "What about the passengers? Where's your Christmas spirit?" Henry considered saying something about the eggnog tankers he had just delivered. "Alfred was rude to me yesterday," Henry thought as he moved off, "but then again I had been rude to him too." But despite this, Henry wasn't going to let Alfred off that easily. "Well, well, well," he chuckled as he came alongside. "Who's the clumsy one now, Alfred?" "Who's out of here?" Alfred replied, his voice muffled by the snow. Henry quickly took Alfred's passenger cars, then returned to pull Alfred out of the snowdrift. Henry pulled with all of his strength, fighting the snow that held Alfred in place. Once Alfred had been freed, the 2 locomotives backed down onto his train, which was waiting on the main line. They weren't going to be able to get through the snowdrift, not without any snowplows. They were going to have to go back to Knapford. A relieved look crossed Alfred's face as they got the train underway. "Thank you for rescuing me," he said, "especially considering I was rude to you yesterday." "Well, it is the season of forgiveness and all that," Henry replied. "And besides, I was rude to you as well, and I think I owe you an apology too." "Shall we start from the beginning again?" Alfred said. Henry and Alfred backed down into Knapford Station to find the Fat Controller waiting for them. "Well done, Henry," he said. "Thank you, sir," Henry replied. "But what about the passengers? We need to get them through." "Yes," Alfred agreed. "And if you fit me with a snowplow, sir, I'd be willing to have another go at that snowdrift." "Thank you, Alfred," the Fat Controller said. "But that won't be needed. We have 2 snow fighting experts who should be arriving about now." A moment later, Donald and Douglas puffed alongside. Coupled back to back with the works coach between their tenders, they were ready to tackle the snow. "Did you want to see us about a wee snowdrift, sir?" Donald asked as he came to a stop. "There's nothing wee about it," Alfred said. "That snowdrift is taller than I am. Experts you may be, but I doubt you'd be able to take care of it easily." "Well, we'll have to see about that," Douglas replied, raring to go. The 2 Scottish twins moved off, ready to do their job. As they did so, one of the station staff came running up to the Fat Controller. He exchanged a few words, then the Fat Controller spun around. "Stop! Stop!" he called. Donald and Douglas quickly came to a halt and reversed back to the platform, wondering what was going on. "Is something the matter, sir?" Donald asked. "I've just been told there's another train coming in," the Fat Controller said. "And with the weather like this, I don't want anyone out there." "Another train?" Alfred asked, surprised. Before anyone could reply, the sound of a familiar whistle drifted through the air. "That sounds like Thomas," Henry observed. They could hear the sound of another engine coming down the line, and they stared curiously into the fog, trying to make out exactly who was arriving. Donald's mouth dropped open. "You dinna say!" he exclaimed in disbelief. The strange train emerging from the darkness of the snowstorm was the last thing any of them were expecting.